Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie Coleman. I'm the Autism Family Educator at Kansas LEND. LEND stands for Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities. As I always say, hence the word LEND. It's a mouthful. We are a workforce training grant funded through MCHB, Maternal Child Health Bureau. We have long-term trainees that come together to learn from different disciplines, and then we bring in the lens of lived experience with family members and self-advocates. So one of the things that we do for our grant is to provide the family education series so that we can provide information to families all across the state of Kansas. Whether you are watching this live or if you are watching the recording on YouTube, thank you for attending and joining us tonight. We appreciate you. We are here to talk about sexual assault and supporting survivors, especially those with disabilities. For that talk, we have Tyler and Maddie from MOCSA, Metropolitan Organization to Counter Sexual Assault. So I am going to turn it over to them and let's get started. Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thank you so much. Hi. Yeah, MOCSA is also a mouthful, just like Len. So you can always call it MOCSA. You can also say like MOSCA will respond to anything. It's totally fine. I also have to say, because I'm using an old PowerPoint, so I don't get in trouble. Our logo has changed, and so has our name, kind of. We're not now the Metropolitan Organization to counter sexual assault, but rather we are the Metropolitan Organization countering sexual assault. A very complicated change. This is not the correct logo, but I didn't update the PowerPoint in time, so here we are. So my apologies. But yes, my name is Tyler. I'm a coordinator of education and outreach here at MOCSA. I've been with MOCSA for I think it'll be 10 years in July, which is a long time. I've kind of been working in the DV, domestic violence, sexual violence kind of realm or field for 15 or so years. I've got a couple of bachelor's degrees. I've got my master's in social work, and I've really tended to focus on supporting survivors of sexual assault, preventing sexual violence from happening in the community, that kind of stuff. I also grew up, my mom's a special ed teacher. I've been around the disability community my whole life. So I have kind of always had, they've always had a special place in my heart. And so we'll get into it later, but what we know is that there's a pretty big intersection between sexual violence or sexual abuse and assault and people with disabilities. I think it's important to talk about, which is why we're here today. So that's a little bit about who I am. Maddie, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Maddie. I use she, her pronouns. Where Tyler is a coordinator, I'm a youth program specialist. So my job is I'm out in the community. I'm in two different schools with middle schools, talking about anti-violence, but I also do a lot of great work with Mallory and GNO, which I'm not sure if we're going to be talking about that today. But yeah, so glad to be here.
Cool. Okay, so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about kind of who we are and what we do first, and then we'll get into I'm not going to say nitty gritty. That's annoying, but we'll get into the meat of the conversation. But first and foremost, MOCSA is, like I said, the Metropolitan Organization countering sexual assault. And really what that means is that we are Kansas City's one and only rape crisis center. Some people will say like sexual assault survivor center. Some people will still say rape crisis center. We respond to any and all. But really the goal of our agency or the reason that we exist is to improve the lives of those that have experienced sexual violence, sexual harassment, sexual assault, etc., and to work on preventing it from happening in the Kansas City community. We do that in a variety of ways. So I will kind of go through. We serve both Kansas and Missouri. So these are the counties that we'll serve. So on the Missouri side, it's going to be Clay, Cass, Platte, and Jackson. And then on the Kansas side, it'll be Wyandotte and Johnson. And really what that means is if somebody experiences um, some sort of sexual violence within that service area, they can have access to our services. Or if they maybe a sexual assault happened in Florida, or California, wherever it is, but they currently live in the Kansas City area, they can also access our services. All of the services that we're going to talk about today are completely free of charge. We don't require insurance. We don't ask for money. They're all offered to the community for a zero cost because what we know is if somebody experiences sexual assault, um, regardless of whether they report it or not, there's a lot of obstacles that are gonna come up, and we don't want the finance piece to be one of those. So we cover the cost of things so that others don't have to. Um, uh, and that's kind of who we are and what we do in terms of county. In fact, fun fact, as of I think it was 2024, don't quote, we're the largest rape crisis center in the country, which is pretty cool. So we do a few things. We have education services, advocacy services, and counseling services. Maddie and I are on the education team. I'm going to plow through this stuff so fast, but if you have questions, please throw it in the chat or feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. But our education services serve mostly K through 12 and then on into adulthood as well. So we do a lot of work in the school systems of Kansas City, whether that's body safety, whether that's dating violence, of course, sexual assault and consent, sexual harassment, etc. As we move into adulthood, that's going to be like supporting survivors for nurses, police officers, school staff, parents, new moms, or doulas. Like it really just kind of depends on who asks us. We did a roller rink the other day, which was pretty cool. Um, so we really try to be out in the community. One of the things that we do on the education side is we have what's called a Healthy Boundaries series. That series is specific to working with, thank you, Maddie, for monitoring the chat. That series exists to really kind of focus on that intersection between folks with intellectual or developmental disabilities and sexual assault as it and it can look like a few different ways. It can be multiple rounds, it can be just one. It is pretty flexible. It can be in the school system, it can be not in the school system, it can be with another program. It really just depends on what people want, but it is specific to folks with disabilities. A lot of the things that we'll talk about today are similar to what is in that presentation. So that's our education team. Our advocates are, I always say they're not attorneys, they're not legal advisors, but they will help navigate the legal system. So should somebody experience some sort of sexual assault, and they want to or they need to navigate the legal system, whether that's a protection order, getting out of a lease because their apartment is no longer a safe space to live, but they don't have 2 grand to break it, whatever those kind of legal bureaucratic mumbo jumbo is, we can help provide some support in navigating that process. So if somebody wants access to, any of the court things or making a police report or going to the hospital for an evidence collection exam, that all lives in the advocacy department. Again, all completely free of charge. We do also have an attorney and a paralegal on staff that also is housed under our advocacy department, and she too provides pro bono free legal representation. So there's a few more criteria that folks might need to meet to be able to qualify for that. But if somebody ever does need an attorney as it relates to some sort of sexual violence that has been experienced, we can provide that service for free. And then our counseling department is as it sounds. It's a counseling department. It's our biggest department. And you name an acronym in the counseling world, DBT, CBT, EMDR, it doesn't matter. We've got folks that are able to, as in licensed and certified to be able to provide those services. So should somebody want counseling services, they are absolutely 100% also completely free of charge, and there's no cap. So sometimes if people have like an EAP or insurance, they will say, well, you get 6, you get 10, and then you have to start to pay out of pocket. We do not have that. So somebody can come once, somebody can come once a week for 10 years. It really just depends on what the need is there. So we do provide those counseling services, and within that is support groups, etc. So for counseling services, we can provide services starting at age 5, and for advocacy services, they start at age 11. The last thing I will say, and then I will leave room for questions, is we do have a 24-hour crisis line. I always like to say it's not necessarily, I'm not going to call it a misnomer because it is a crisis line, but people don't have to be in crisis to call it. In fact, most often I will refer to our crisis line as really our tether to the Kansas City community. If your kid or your spouse or somebody says something and you're like, ah, this is weird, I just need to like bounce ideas, call it. If you want to get connected to services, call it. If it's the only crisis line that you know and it has nothing to do with sexual violence, call it and we will connect you somewhere else. So it really just depends on kind of what you're looking for, but you can always call that crisis number. There are two numbers if you see on the bottom of the screen. There's an 816 and a 913. It's the same thing. But Missouri people are very loyal to their 816 and 913 people are very loyal to the Kansas people are very loyal to 913 and we don't want to mix and match when it comes to those. So we try to meet people where they're at and we have one for both, but you can call either. And that is answered 24/7, 365. Any questions around what we do, how to access services, anything like that? I know I kind of plowed pretty quickly through it, but
Tyler, I just have one quick question.
yeah,
Um,
please.
since this is for the whole state of Kansas, right? This information, and I know you're only here in the Wasatch,
Mm-hmm.
Johnson County. Do
Mm-hmm.
you have a link to other crisis places throughout the state of Kansas or something like that that we can share?
Maddie,
Um,
will you put the coalition websites in
Yeah,
the
I
website?
was
I
just
mean, in the
about to
chat.
say I'll do that. Give me one
that's
Thank
second.
you.
that's
Thank you.
awesome, and I
Yes.
will add it to
So
the whatchamacallit later. So thank
that
you.
brings up a very good point though. Um, Couple of things. First and foremost, what Maddie is putting in the chat is if you're not familiar with DV or SV, each state has a coalition that houses all of the agencies or organizations that do that domestic or sexual violence work in that city. Or, I'm sorry, in that state. So what you can then do is go to that website, and usually there's like an interactive map. And you can enter your zip code or click your county, and that's going to tell you what access to services you have in that specific county. So each state has one. So that's a beautiful place that you can go to start with. The other thing is um, the way that we are funded as an agency. We can go back to our this slide. Technically, okay, we serve these 6 counties, but actually, we do have some funding that allows us to serve statewide. It's going to look different. So, like if somebody can't specifically or explicitly come to the office, then their services that they get may be a little bit different. Than if somebody lives in Wichita, but technically they do still qualify for services. So if somebody needs counseling, and they're not finding what they need in Sedgwick County, for example, I don't know why I'm picking on Wichita, they can absolutely call our crisis line and we can certainly kind of talk through what that would look like. We do obviously do in-person counseling services, but we can also do online secure counseling services that way as well. So technically, we have the service area on the slides, but we can serve both the states of Missouri and Kansas.
Great. Thank you for
Yeah,
clarifying.
of course.
I appreciate that.
Other questions that anybody has? Usually when there's no questions, that means that I did an incredible job and okay, great. Just kidding. I'm just fishing for compliments. So, I do like to start by kind of gauging, well, first let's do this. Obviously, we're on the internet, but even so, it's a conversation around sexual violence. So by no means is today going to be particularly complicated. We're not showing any videos. I'm not going to like call on anyone, probably other than Maddie. Um, uh, to ask any personal questions. Like it's going to be very chill and very easy. But I do want to recognize that we're talking about sexual assault and it's tender and it's complicated. And if you need to hide your camera or you need to step away, one, I'm not going to know about it. And two, that's totally fine. It's totally not a big deal. But I do also value your thoughts and opinions. So I do encourage if you've got a question or you have a statement or you want to share something, please feel free to unmute or raise your hand or throw it in the chat, whatever you want. Because I'm happy to answer any questions. But I do also tend to like to ask some questions as well. And the first one that I will ask is when you think about that relationship or that intersection between sexual assault or sexual violence and people with disabilities, what tends to pop into your mind? Is it an obstacle? Is it something that you've seen done really well? Like, what do you think about when you think about the intersection between intellectual developmental disability and sexual violence? If you've ever thought of that. Any ideas?
My thought is lack of education for
On whose part? Or
individuals.
like,
On the individual part, like as family members, we don't want to talk about it with our children who aren't neurodiverse. Then you throw
mm-hmm,
neurodiversity into it, and I think it gets, like somebody said, an increased vulnerability. But,
yeah,
um, you know, like it's not going to happen to our children because we're
yeah,
helicopter moms or something like
yeah,
that. But we can't
mm-hmm,
be with them 24/7. So we have to talk about it. We have to,
mm-hmm,
normalize it just as much as anything else so that if
mm-hmm,
that should happen, they can come to us and feel comfortable talking about it so that it, like when we were talking earlier, it doesn't come out in behaviors and we're missing it.
mm-hmm.
We don't know what's happening. So that's my thought.
We had someone in the chat say, I think my daughter may not recognize the red flags of potential abuse, which is a very
Yeah,
common fear that we hear from parents. So you're
totally.
not
Yeah, and
alone
we'll
in
talk
that.
about that. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
Other thoughts? What do you think of when you think around or think about, like I said, that intersection between sexual violence and disability?
I also wonder, and we know that women, and I don't want to exclude men by no
I
means,
hear you.
but um, well, let's just not even put women to it, women and men. Those that are abused aren't believed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think you're right,
And
though. I think,
so,
but see, even that right there, I think is an interesting point too, that like sometimes it feels like I don't exactly know how to talk about it, or I don't want to say the wrong thing or whatever, but I think you're right. I think it can happen to men, it can happen to women, but kind of regardless of who it happens to, oftentimes one of the biggest obstacles that we hear from survivors is exactly that. Like I fear I won't be believed, or I don't want to be a burden, or I don't really know exactly what even happened to myself, let alone enough to say it out into the universe, right? And I don't want to like muddy the waters for no reason, right?
mhm,
And definitely, um, as somebody that's worked kind of with people with disabilities that have or have not experienced it, right? Like I've seen both. Um, that feels exponentially more complicated sometimes. People are scared that they're not going to be believed for sure. Um, yeah, I see. Okay, so I think not being believed could be even more prevalent in this population. Second, guessing that they actually knew what was happening and if they misunderstood, since so many of our people have a hard time understanding social situations. The social situations and like the social cues and boundaries is so real and so complicated. And I think that goes exactly back to the education piece. And honestly, same with like the red flag of it all. I think it's that when I think of the relationship or the intersection between sexual violence and neurodiversity or folks with disabilities, I also tend to think that we as a culture tend to desexualize, especially our adults with disabilities, right? Obviously, we don't want to sexualize children and we don't want to do that, but as people age, right, we as a culture tend to desexualize our adults with disabilities, and so in our minds, we're like, well,
kind of.
I'm not even going to have a conversation with this person because like it feels uncomfortable, it feels icky. I'm not comfortable having this, but also they're like 40. And so it's like, well, we should probably be having this conversation, right? Like because just, like it already exists, so we should be having that. And so totally. The infantilization of adults with disabilities is we bump into that a lot, for sure. Any final
Yeah,
thoughts? Yeah,
we
go
don't
ahead.
want to think, we don't want to think of that as parents. And that's just, again, with any children, but especially
Totally.
those with disabilities.
Yeah.
My son is 29. We've had these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Okay, so as we kind of think through this, I really quickly want to to define just the way that we talk about sexual assault and consent, and then we'll spend the bulk of the time talking about those red flags and then supporting survivors. So the way that MOCSA tends to define sexual assault is any sexual activity without consent. Many, many times, we will hear people use the terms like sexual assault or rape synonymously. And that's not necessarily wrong. Obviously, rape is sexual assault, but sexual assault is an umbrella term that includes more than just rape, right? So we really, really try to emphasize that it's any sexual activity. It doesn't have to just be penetrative sex, without consent, but any sexual activity, including kissing, right? So like anything that happens without consent is considered sexual assault, right? And so when we work with people with disabilities, obviously, we will get the giggles out because we're talking about sex and sexuality. But then after that, we really try to talk about like, well, what does consent mean? Um, uh, and really identify and be very specific about what that looks like. So obviously, I assume that we all know what consent means here. If we don't, you can like private message me in the chat and we'll get you taken care of. But consent is important to understand in both the sexual piece of things and not. And so when we work with people with disabilities, oftentimes we're first gonna talk about like wanted hugs, right? Like or we ease into the conversation around it, but we are also explicit and we not explicit, specific about like what we're saying, right? Like if you want to kiss someone, how do we practice consent? What does that sound like? What does that look like? Are you texting it? Are you typing it? Or are you saying it in person? What are the differences there? And so really thinking about kind of what that looks like is important. Okay, so when we talk about consent, the way that we always like to talk about it is it's a freely given and enthusiastic yes. It's freely given, meaning there are no strings attached, right? I get to make a decision with, for, and about my body under the assumption that all of the information I'm using to make this decision is not intended to harm me, hurt me, trick me, put me in a bad position, etc. Right? I get to make a decision on my own free will, which also means I get to take it back if I don't want to. If I want to make out with someone and then their breath is really bad and I want to change my mind and not do that, I'm allowed to do that, right? Then obviously we talk about enthusiasm. One, first and foremost, do people want to be participating in this? And two, do people understand or do people know what's happening to them? Sometimes when we're talking about consent, we will get conversations around like, well, people with disabilities can't give their consent, right? Like legally that they can't do that. That's desexualizing, right? Because usually the answer is yes, they can. Even if they are not their own guardian, they can give their consent, right? They are legally allowed to do so. But what is required is a conversation around, do we know what we're consenting to? Do we understand what sexual or what sex is biologically? Do we understand the risks of pregnancy or STIs or emotional attachment? Do we understand kind of what we're consenting to? If we don't, and or if someone is using that lack of knowledge to trick them into having sex, it's not sexual assault, or it is sexual assault. It's not sex. There's no consent there. Does that make sense? So sexual assault is any sexual activity, right, without consent, and consent is a freely given and enthusiastic yes. Understanding that people get to make the decisions kind of without fear of force, coercion, blackmail. If someone is forcing them, if someone is blackmailing them, if someone is scaring them or tricking them, it doesn't count as true consent, even if they've said yes, quote unquote. Were there any thoughts or questions around that piece? Okay, cool. So what I do want to talk about is I do want to share some statistics. I don't always love a statistic, but I do think that they're important um, uh, to create space and to create an understanding. So I will share my screen again. All right. Can folks see that? Cool. So obviously, statistics change all the time, depending on research and depending on data that comes in and out. But in general, people with disabilities tend to experience sexual violence at higher rates than neurotypical people. Okay. Um, Obviously, some reports indicate that up to 80% of women, 30% of men with disabilities have experienced sexual violence. I've seen numbers that are even a little bit higher than that. So again, grain of salt there. But people with intellectual or developmental disabilities also experience higher rates of multiple victimizations. So they may experience it more than often or more than once, right? What do you think are some reasons behind that? Why might the re-victimization rate be higher for people with disabilities? Any ideas?
Because, and I hate to say this, but they're seen as easy targets,
Totally.
right? They're not,
Mm-hmm.
it's what it is.
Absolutely. Especially kind of going back to if we've as a culture, I know we in this group have not, but if we as a culture are desexualizing people with disabilities, um, well then think through the cultural impact of that, right? Why would people, quote unquote, believe a person that doesn't even know what they're talking about because we as a society haven't taught them that, right? And so, yeah, absolutely, it makes them a vulnerable population because perpetrators know that culturally they're not as believed as a neurotypical person might be. Aubrey says they might not understand what they experienced was wrong, totally, or sexual assault, especially if it was a trusted person. That's so confusing. 100%. Oftentimes, I guess I don't want to say oftentimes. Something that I have seen many times is a deep desire to have a relationship. And we will do anything that we can do to get or keep a relationship because we as human beings value that relationship, right? And so part of what I think is a way to support people with disabilities is first and foremost to understand or talk through the word relationship. Not every relationship that we have is sexual or romantic. And yet, oftentimes, when we hear the word relationship, we tend to think sexual or romantic. And so there's a lot of emphasis placed on value of me. You're totally right, Mallory, with like the connections of friendships and relationships. We we place a lot of like value on having those relationships or not. And if we don't have those, then like what's wrong with me? And so we want them so deeply. And oftentimes that can kind of cause blinders. But I think you're right, Aubrey, in that sometimes something happens where they don't even know or are able to define or have the language to understand what happened to them is wrong. And that is where the education side comes in, where it's our job to have the conversations that may be uncomfortable so that they understand and know what is acceptable or what is normal and what is not, right? What is inappropriate, what is wrong, what is sexual assault. Even if it's their boyfriend or their girlfriend or someone that they love deeply. Okay? Um that's really hard though. I mean, definitely easier said than done, but it is so important to understand that. The other thing that I will say with the re-victimization of it all is that something that is pretty common also involves like financial abuse. So many times you will see the like, give me money or oh my gosh, I love you so much. You're the best girlfriend I've ever had. Also, I need $100, right? And so that financial abuse is really, really complicated and really, really hard. But what it does is it creates a link or a tether or a leash where now it feels like, well, I've given this person so much money that I feel like I have to like see it through. And that can sometimes keep people in a harmful relationship longer than should happen, right? Yeah, what's up?
Oh, I was going to say, and you may be getting to this, so I may be
No,
jumping
I
the
love
fence,
that.
but I think people with disabilities, yes, victims, but they can also be perpetrators that
Yeah,
not knowing that they are. Like that's
totally.
one thing, I have spent a lot of time talking to my son, like you have to have consent. You have to, if a girl says no, That's it. You walk away.
Mm-hmm.
You don't
Mm-hmm.
try to encourage her to do more. You don't try to say,
Mm-hmm.
oh, come on, you know.
Yeah.
Just because they have disabilities doesn't mean, you know, like we do
Mm-hmm.
want the connections, friendships, and relationships. And sometimes we don't understand when someone says no. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, yes, here we are teaching about this side, but we also have to remember
Mm-hmm.
our kiddos can be those that
Totally.
assault someone too. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to educate from that perspective too. So again,
Yeah.
you maybe
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's a beautiful point that I was going to get to, but honestly in like 0.3 seconds. So like you
good.
got it there. But yes, 100%. The other thing that's complicated is that lack of like understanding of like social connections and boundaries can be so complicated to navigate. And just like somebody might not know that what happened to them is wrong, somebody might not understand that what is happening is also inappropriate. Um, so, for example, well, actually, I'm not going to share that, but there have been situations where there comes some situations where like there's like perpetration because we didn't understand what was happening in the situation there. And I think that that's very, very important too. One of the things that we'll talk about in that healthy boundaries series that I think is an important concept to talk about with our neurodivergent populations is the idea of rejection and how you're allowed to be sad, you're allowed to be frustrated, you're allowed to be angry even. But what are healthy ways to be sad or be frustrated or be angry? And if I am using my phone and I'm, blasting text messages with somebody, that is not okay. Or if somebody says they don't want to do something, that doesn't give me, and I may be angry, but just because I'm angry doesn't give me the right to harm them, hurt them, make them feel bad, etc. So I think it's sometimes having that conversation around like people are allowed to say yes or no, and you may feel bad. You may not have gotten what you wanted, and that's okay, and we can talk through that. But that just because you feel bad doesn't mean they have to do exactly what you want them to do. The idea of having too much money, time invested in a relationship is called the sunk cost fallacy, by the way. Love, for sure. Um, Aubrey coming in with the facts. Appreciate you. Any other thoughts or ideas around um, what we've been talking about so far? Okay. The one thing that I do like to always say is that I don't necessarily always think that people realize that sexual assault is the number one underreported crime in the country, and it has been forever, for so long. So it's the number one underreported crime in the country, regardless of who experienced that. Okay? But people with disabilities, it goes even farther underreported, right? So in general, it's the number one underreported crime, but people with disabilities have very, very, very low rates of reporting. Okay. Now, people don't have to report. People get to process and navigate and understand an experience that happened to them all on their own. They don't have to make a report if they don't want to, of course, unless they're a child. Um, but the number of reports is really, really low for people with disabilities. Probably because of all of the same things we've already been talking about, right? Culturally, we desexualize them, the fear of not being believed, not necessarily understanding that what happened to them was bad, but it is extremely low. That does not mean, though, just because somebody doesn't report, that doesn't mean that they're not telling the truth. In fact, there's a lot of stats and there's a lot of research that says that, well, first and foremost, sexual assault in general, there's a lot of rhetoric that says that it's not as prevalent as the stats are saying, or regret sex, or people are lying about it. But in general, usually the number is around 2% or so of people are actually found to be telling not the truth about sexual assault, which means that 98% of the time that someone discloses a sexual assault, it's true, right? That number for people with disabilities of telling the truth about sexual violence that's happened to them, if they do understand that what happened to them was sexual violence, it's really, really high. So when people with disabilities do disclose, they're usually telling the truth. right? But that's not what our culture says. Our culture says, prove it, right? So it's really, really important to understand that when we're thinking about supporting survivors, it's being crystal clear about this isn't your fault, and I totally believe you. I think that's really, really important. And I know that that's like the buzzword or like the buzz reaction to like if somebody discloses or we're talking about sexual assault, but especially in this case, it goes a million miles. It goes so far because it matters so much. Okay? Okay. I do want to talk about some of the like signs of abuse, signs of sexual assault, whether that has happened already and you're kind of trying to keep an eye out or not. But before I do that, does anybody have questions so far or thoughts? I also like thoughts. Okay. When you're thinking about signs of abuse or red flags, what have you, what tends to pop into your mind? What do you tend to think of first?
Oh, there's so much there. I think someone who's tearful and fearful and withdrawn.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know that I have thoughts.
Sure.
I've never done training for, red flags for people with disabilities. Like,
Sure.
I'm assuming a lot of that is going to be the exact same, but I'm sure that there's other
Yeah.
behaviors that
Mm-hmm.
um that I'm not thinking about.
Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts? Increased behaviors for
Someone
sure.
else has said,
Emotional, more than usual, crying, can't sleep. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, probably not as like talkative. Like, I imagine someone
Withdrawn.
who's just
Sure.
does
Yeah.
withdraw and doesn't talk as
Yeah.
much and is not like wanting to be your best friend. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep,
depending on
totally.
the close relationship that you
Yeah.
have with your
Yeah.
child.
Yeah. I read somewhere once that the best way to pay attention to and understand this goes across the board. It's not necessarily just for people with disabilities, but with anyone is first and foremost understanding the person's baseline. Because without understanding the person's baseline, you're not going to understand those changes that you see,
Yep.
right? Regression is huge. Um, I may be a really reserved, quiet person. I'm not. But maybe I am. Um, and all of a sudden I'm overcompensating. Or I am cleaning my room or my apartment way more than I used to, or whatever. Things that sometimes look positive, but if the baseline is different, can be a sign that something's changed. And it doesn't necessarily mean sexual assault, but it's a pretty good indicator that like something's going on where somebody maybe feels the need to overcompensate or control something that they need or whatever. So yes, I think oftentimes we see the regression side of things, and that's also totally true. But I also sometimes will see the opposite of that, where people overcompensate, right? I am a pretty reserved person and now I'm super talkative. Why is that? Again, could just be that they are more comfortable around you or something else happened, but could be a sign that something has happened. Definitely like the wedding, the bed, the pants, other signs of sexual abuse, classics, absolutely. Um, Something that I have seen and worked pretty closely with people is yes, that change in behavior, but that change in behavior especially specific to sex. So if we've already had conversations around sex, sexuality, what that looks like, what that means, etc. Yeah, having knowledge of mature sexual acts that I shouldn't know. So if I have a kid that is young, and they have access to information or language that they shouldn't, they're saying things that you're like, I didn't learn that until I was 22. Where did they get that? Now, some of that is this, which we can certainly talk about, but really paying attention to like, should they developmentally know that or not? Um, because sometimes that can be a really good indicator. that something's going on. Maddie.
We have a great point in the chat from Aubrey.
Oh, please.
Yes, specific fears of certain caregivers and hypersexuality. Yeah,
Aubrey. Yep.
yeah.
Sorry, I was gonna say hypersexuality is my next point for sure.
Go for it, Tyler.
Oh, you can. Okay, thanks. I didn't mean to jump over you. Yes, just like the opposite with like regression and not, it's overcompensating with the sexuality piece of it. So now it's I want to control, I want to have sex, I want to control how I do it, who I do it with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes that can again not on its face look like a red flag, but can usually be a sign or an indicator that something has happened. So it's paying attention to that. It's also paying attention to like probing questions. So it's definitely, I've been in situations with folks where we'll be having a conversation in a safe space around sexuality or sexual assault or whatever, but they're asking questions that feel like just say it, right? But they're testing the boundaries, they're testing the limit to see how far they can get with I want to ask a question, but I don't want to ask a question, right? And that's really complicated. That's really hard, and we all do that. But I think that that is a sign that they're thinking about something and they don't necessarily know what your reaction is going to be, but that culturally we understand that sexual assault is bad to talk about. And so I don't want to bring it up because I don't want to get in trouble for bringing up something bad. But really, they need to talk about it and they need to process it and have that conversation. So that is also like a red flag is like obviously the hypersexuality, but also like just trying to say something, but they can't totally say it. And you're like, let's just get to getting. But it's hard. It's sometimes really hard. Um, Something else that is a pretty big red flag is like sexual obligations. Oftentimes people will feel like sexually obligated um to give their partner whatever they want for the sake of the relationship. Even though we can see from the outside that maybe it's an unhealthy relationship. And so definitely there have been situations that I've seen where people will say like, "Oh, well, they're really mad at me, but like we'll just do this," and then they're never mad after this, after we have sex. And you're like, "Well, is that true consent though? Or is that just like appeasing the harmful or the unhealthy relationship?" Right? And so it's thinking about like, do people feel in conversations obligated to appease their partner if they're in a relationship that is potentially harmful or violent. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a boyfriend or a girlfriend, even just like a sexual partner that they're with. But yes, any other red flags that people can think of? I only have one more, but I wanted to gauge. Okay. The last one is everyone's favorite, social media. Um, Social media is hard. It's so complicated because we need it and we love it, and it's sometimes really great and then sometimes really hard and sometimes really bad. And so, definitely red flags can exist there. Again, doesn't necessarily mean explicitly that there's been a sexual assault, but things like being extra secretive with their phone or a change in behavior with their phone or their social media or whatever. Or I've honestly even seen situations where people are saying things like in comments on Facebook or Instagram or posting articles or posting things and you're like that feels out of the norm for that person. It behooves me to check in on them. And so it's really understanding that. I will also say the internet is a great place for that financial abuse that happens. And so really being on top of having those conversations around um, moving money and sending money. And just because it's easy doesn't mean we should do it. And just because somebody asks you doesn't mean you should do it. Um, all of those types of things. So those are some red flags. Obviously, there's plenty, but I do want to talk about like supporting survivors. So if we get a disclosure or a report, or somebody tells us that they've experienced sexual assault, what are some ways that we feel like would be a useful or beneficial way to react to that? How should we react if somebody discloses that they've experienced sexual assault? Any ideas?
Sorry, will you repeat that one more time?
Yep. How should we react
Oh,
if we get a disclosure or somebody tells us that they've experienced sexual assault? I believe you, totally. So big.
I, yeah, that's
Tell them we believe them, tell them it wasn't their fault, for sure.
listen to what they have to say. Listen to them completely. Don't
Yeah.
like try to rush and try to
Yeah.
get the, like, hurry up, tell me what you're saying. Like, if it takes four
Mm-hmm.
hours to let them say that, then
Mm-hmm.
give them that
Totally.
4 hours to share it to them because it's going to be hard for them to get it out.
Yeah. Maintain a neutral face, active listening, validation, and encourage them to seek help. Ooh, how many of you struggle with maintaining a neutral face? That's hard. It's so hard.
I
I'm
can't
pretty
play
good at it
poker.
now, but in like the professional setting, if I'm in a personal setting, it's terrible. You know exactly what I'm thinking. But usually in a professional setting, I'm just like, hmm, you know. But I do think that's huge. Mallory, thank you for trusting me with this. Beautiful. Absolutely. I think listening is huge, especially because um, uh, we as a society, we as a culture really value the like the evidence, the facts, the prove it of it all. And that can get, that is important, but especially in that initial disclosure, that may not be the most important thing in the moment. So maybe that is, maybe the most important thing in the moment of them is just like them getting it out, right? So when we talk about like listening fully, there are definitely some ways to do that. Aubrey says, as a mandated reporter, I would also tell them that legally I have to report that this happened. Absolutely. So informed consent is huge, especially when you're working with kids. When you're giving, when, so Aubrey, when I give my informed consent, I will also say like, legally I have to report this to blank. And what does that mean? That's going to look like this. It's going to sound like this. I'm going to call this person and try to be really specific or explicit about what you're doing, transparent. Because sometimes reporting to blah, blah, blah doesn't feel like plain language and people don't totally know what that means. So thinking about that is huge. Um, when we get disclosures, the way that we listen is we get comfortable with silence, we get comfortable with tears. We get comfortable with, I said this, no, wait, actually, this, actually, no, I was right the first time, right? Because what's happening is people have to process. Um, and sometimes that requires, if able, if verbal, verbally saying it out loud and like putting the pieces together. We can think and think and think about something, but until we've expressed it another way, it doesn't always land in the same way. So when we're thinking about supporting survivors and managing disclosures, first, excuse me, and foremost, we have to ask open-ended questions. What happened next? What happened after that? Um, all of those types of things. I try really hard to avoid the word you if at all possible, right? Because if I say, well, what did you do next? Or what did you do after that? It feels like I'm pointing a finger, even though I'm not. It can be interpreted as, um, what did you do wrong? So what happened next? What did they do? What did the perpetrator do, or whatever you want to say? But what did they do? But if you say what did you do, that sometimes feels blamey. So we try to avoid that. But asking open-ended questions. The other thing to do is to match the language that they're using. If somebody comes to you and they say, well, my boyfriend hurt me, my girlfriend made me feel bad, and I say, I'm so sorry that that happened to you. You didn't deserve that. Can you talk to me about what you mean when you said that, like, your boyfriend raped you? Well, no, 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 that's not what I said, though, right? It may be what they're saying, but the language that they used was hurt. And so it's my job to match that language. Now, if I don't know what something means, I can totally be like, hey, Maddie, when you say hurt, Can you tell me what you mean by that? Right? You can ask for clarifying questions, but always match the language that they're using. And then as their language changes, so too can your language change. But it's really, really, really important that you're not putting words in their mouth for a couple of reasons. One, they're the expert of their own experience. You're not. And also, what we know about trauma is that memory is really, really fickle. And I don't want to plant something that's wrong that then is a discrepancy later when they go to make a report, if they go to make a report. I don't want to be the reason that they get something thrown out. I want to be the reason that I want to be the safe space that they have to talk it through so that they don't have to do that later. Does that make sense? So when we're listening, it's getting comfortable with silence, getting comfortable with tears, and really paying attention to matching that language and asking open-ended questions. Um, the other things that I will say, think about your physical space. Um, a lot of times what comes with physical space are power dynamics. So when we're thinking about like having this conversation, maybe they've disclosed in a loud room. Well, that may not be the best place to have that conversation, right? So, hey, do you mind if we go on a walk or have this conversation in another room? I want to be, totally present for this. It's thinking about the space that you're having. When you're in that space, am I between the door and them? Because I don't want to do that, right? That feels like a power move. Are they sitting and I'm standing above them? Because I don't want to do that, right? So it's really thinking about the nitty-gritty, the details, and equaling that playing field. Making sure that you're there. Sometimes it's also important to be cognizant of just being alone in a room with another person, right? So obviously keeping your windows and things open, but even just from like a making sure that they feel safe. They may not feel safe in a room by themselves with another person. So it's being creative to, do you want to go on a walk? Do you want to be in a public space, but where nobody can hear us, but everybody can see us? It's thinking creatively about like, what's the physical safe space that we have created so that we can have this conversation? And is it a space that we are able to have potentially a lengthy conversation? Because if it's in a space where somebody's going to interrupt and stop the flow or whatever, then that may be the only opportunity that you have to have this conversation with them, and it's gotten cut short because like the vibe killed, right? And so we want to make sure like, do we have the opportunity to have this conversation in a safe space? And if we don't have that, then how do we say, hey, we can't have this conversation right now, but I will follow up with you at when blah 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 and be specific about that and then do it, right? Plenty of times I've been doing groups with people with disabilities and I will have already been there for like an hour and a half and I'm like, I'm tired. I want to go home. And then somebody says something and they disclose and I'm like, oof, okay. And so we need to have the conversation. And so it's thinking about like, how can we create a space that still respects my boundaries and their boundaries? It can't happen in this very moment, but we are going to have this conversation. Does that make sense? Mallory said, I love that you're talking about this. So many times people feel heard or seen first. The first time, like, feel impulsive to unload in front of a group and that they just met, and it's hard to navigate. Totally, 100%. It's thinking about, that's definitely been a situation I've been in where, hey, thank you so much for sharing that in this group. We don't have time to talk about it right now, but I'm going to follow up with you later. Because one, I don't want to trigger anybody else and nobody else gets to have the details of this. That's not their business, right? But in their mind, they're like, "Oh my gosh, this happened to me. I'm relating to this conversation." And that's beautiful, but let's protect the way that we have that conversation. Okay, the last thing I will say is thinking about tangible ways to communicate. Sometimes people are not verbal. So have I created the access or the safe space for people to disclose in a nonverbal way? An example of this, I was working with a group of people. It was kind of like a love triangle. It was two men that were best friends, and one of them was dating a woman. And the boyfriend made the girlfriend angry. She was mad. So to get back at her boyfriend, she performed oral sex on his best friend. So he was assaulted, and he didn't really know what that meant. It broke up the relationship, it broke up the friendship, it got really ugly, but nobody really, and then so we saw a shift in personality. he went into himself. He was really reserved. Um, and no one knew what was going on. And it wasn't until we downloaded a new like adults app on his iPad that had like depictions of like sexual acts and like stick figures that he could point to oral sex and then the sad face and then we could puzzle piece it together and understand what was happening. So it's important that we're creating the access and the opportunity for people to have this. Obviously, people can type, people can do that, but even that sometimes feels uncomfortable. So are we diversifying the way that we're creating space for people to have conversations, verbally or not verbally? That's huge. The other thing is use tangible examples. This is definitely for like the prevention side of things, but like it can be sometimes really tricky to be like, well, how would you feel if blah, 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 blah? And it's a completely hypothetical situation rather than, hey, we're watching this TV show. Something just happened. Let's talk this through. What would you do in the situation? How would you know what I mean? It's something that's physical and tangible in there. And that is huge. And it sometimes takes the pressure off of you so that you don't have to like create a hypothetical situation in your head and then navigate your own hypothetical situation because that sometimes is confusing. It's what do you think about this? And then using that as a door to have a conversation that can otherwise be complicated. So, tangible, creating safe spaces physically and emotionally, asking open-ended questions, um, anything else you can think of in terms of supporting survivors. And or we have 2 minutes left, so any questions people have. Okay.
I think, you know, my thing is, it's kind of like when we first find out that our children have disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
they're still the same person.
Yeah.
I love you, even though now, diagnosis, and I know that a assault may change the person, but I still love you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think making sure that when you are supporting survivors, especially if you're a family member, right? Like, I'm not talking about you all at MOCSA
Mm-hmm.
or a social worker or a psychologist or
Mm-hmm.
a doctor or anything like that. But from a parent perspective, and your child tells you that, you let them know that I still love you. Like,
Totally.
I won't,
Totally.
sorry, this is going to make me emotional, but I still love you. And whatever you're saying, I'm not mad
Mm-hmm.
at you. I'm not, it's not your fault. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not mad at you. I still love you.
Mm-hmm.
I will support you through all of this, and we will
Totally.
figure it out and navigate it together as
Yeah. Yeah.
parents.
Something you said it reminded me of something that I heard from a parent a while ago with that whole like, oh my gosh, like, I'm so sorry this happened to you, et cetera, but like, but I still love you. And somebody was like, nope, it's and I still love you. Because the experience exists. And my love, right? And care for you also exists. And I'm gonna love and support you through this. Um, and so, because sometimes people will get hung up on that but, right? On the word, LOL. I did not just say hung up on that but. That's not what I meant to say. Hung up on the word but, right? And
Hmm.
so it's and I still love you, but you're totally right. It's oftentimes that fear of like I don't know if anybody's going to believe me or I'm making things complicated, especially if it's a family member. That's really, really hard to navigate. And so it's being crystal clear. I'm sorry that this happened to you. You did not deserve it. And I absolutely still love you, right? Any other thoughts or questions that people have? Because it's 7 o'clock.
This has been amazing.
Okay, good. If you ever have questions, I'm going to leave my email in the chat. You can always, always, always email me, reach out to me, ask questions, confidentially, of course. And then, of course, you can always call that crisis line. It's a completely confidential crisis line, of course, with the exceptions of informed consent and all of that. But you can always call and just bounce ideas. You don't have to give your name. If you ever feel like you need support in that way, please, please, please reach out. We do provide services for people that have experienced sexual violence, but also support systems. So even if your child or something like that is not receiving MOCSA services, but you feel like I need some support with how to navigate what's happened, you also qualify for services. So you also can totally call that number, get connected, and we will totally help you out. Okay? Thank you
This is
so much for
great,
giving me your time.
Heather. Yeah, I can't wait to bring you back for I want to, you said boundaries. I'm like, oh, I told Mallory, I was texting Mallory. I'm like, oh, I got to bring him back for boundaries. So
Sure,
thank you.
anytime.
I appreciate
There was a
that.
question in the chat, are the services in Kansas or nationwide? Beautiful question. Kansas and Missouri. Not nationwide, unfortunately. But if there's ever a situation where you need connected to another state, we can usually kind of help navigate that process.
Yeah, and I know that this is not an easy thing for us parents to talk about any day of the week or year. We
Sure.
don't, but I think it's really important. So if you are a parent and you are watching this video, and you've gotten to this point, I'm proud of you. I'm glad you
Yeah, it
are
was a
doing
long one.
this
Kudos
too.
to you.
It is, no, it's not long. I mean, it's been fantastic. So thank you, everybody.
Sure.
I appreciate that.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.